Morning, everyone. Welcome to Lake Norman Church of Christ. Welcome to the auditorium class. For those in person as well as those connecting online, Howard is going to be bringing us another lesson here in a few minutes. But before we go to the lesson, we're going to take prayer requests and have a prayer. And Andy, if I could ask you to lead us in the prayer, that would be great. Do we have any prayer requests this morning, Mary Ann? Okay, so our neighbors, Bob and Diane, as well as Aunt Peggy, got Melissa. Okay, great. Thank you. So, a praise report for Melissa's parents, but continued prayer request as well. Yes. Sylvia Brown, yes. In the hospital, you say it, in West Virginia. Yes. In Murphy, you said, right? Okay, so the students in Murphy, North Carolina, with the loss of a couple of teachers to COVID. Yeah, Angie.
Gabby and Ivory.
Yes, Gabby and Ivory. Yeah, so Gabby and Ivory. Any others? Okay, well, if there are no others, then Andy will lead us in a prayer, please.
Let's go to God in prayer. Heavenly Father, we come to you now just to thank you this day that we come together and worship you, Father, fellowship with one another. Such a blessing to be able to have time to study your word, to grow closer to you, and grow stronger in our faith. Father, we have a number of people who want to lift up to you this morning. We want to lift up Aunt Peggy. This is Mary Ann's aunt. Just be with her. Her health is not that good, and just continue to pray for the efforts that are being done to help her around the house in the next week or so. We also want to pray for Bob and Diane. We know that their health has gotten worse over the years. It's been a real struggle not seeing Bob out walking around through his yard. Just pray for them as they continue to go through these health conditions. We're so thankful that Melissa's parents are doing better. It's good seeing them yesterday, and just to give you praise, God, for helping them through this. We also want to pray for all those who are still battling with COVID. We know that there's the teachers that passed away because of COVID from Murphy, North Carolina. We pray that you be with them. I also want to pray for Gabby right now. We know, Father, that she's gone through a lot in her personal life. Right now, we know that this time is, I can only imagine how difficult it is. Just pray for her. Pray, Father, that she knows that we're continually thinking about her and praying for her. We're also praying for her. We know that she's really just on the road by this point. Just want to lose this situation. Continue to use this for her prayer. We also pray for me as she continues to have more tests run and to try to figure out what's going on with her. And we just pray as they meet with the doctors on Tuesday that they're able to figure out something. Father, you have humbled us with your word, and you've given us great hope to know that your promises are real and that you'll take care of us. And I just pray, Father, that we can rely on that promise, rely on the love and the care that you give us. And we just thank you so much for your church family. was the one thing that was holding us together was our church family. We thank you so much for that. So we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Good. Good morning, everyone, again. Again, I'm substituting for Dr. Byron. He'll be teaching again next week. Let me get this thing on. We're in Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 through 7. And if you're looking for an ulterior backup passages, Luke 6 is the Sermon on the Mount as much as he has it. Seems to me like it's the first and fourth beatitude, maybe the ninth. Anyway, you'll find it in the 6th chapter of Luke. Mark has his interspersed, so it's not so easy to find. We talked a little bit last week. We got up to verse 7 on the Sermon on the Mount, 5:7, and we covered. Well, I didn't. Dr. Richard did 7. I did 8. So we'll begin in the 9th, 10th verse. Does anyone have questions on the Sermon on the Mount before we really get started? No question on the Sermon on the Mount, huh? Well, that's interesting. Let me begin with the 9th verse, and that again is the 5th chapter of Matthew. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Peacemakers, am I on, Jonathan? It doesn't sound like it. Oh, I'm not. So I'm all right? No matter whether I'm all right or not, he'll be fine. Matthew puts this in here. There's probably some historical basis behind it. Matthew, as I've told you before, writes his gospel, let's say 59 AD, maybe 60. And that's just prior to the revolt that the Jews had in relationship to the Romans. And there was a specific group of people that were called zealots. And they were pushing the people to revolt. They didn't really give them an option. You either revolt and supported us, or they murdered them. I mean, it was Jerusalem, fairly close proximity. I mean, you didn't get away with very much, and so they kept pushing the people to revolt, and they also was executing certain people that they didn't think was supporting them, et cetera, et cetera. That's probably a little bit why Matthew makes an emphasis here on the peacemakers. I mean, or rather, I shouldn't say Matthew. Jesus makes the emphasis on the peacemakers, and Matthew's bringing it out as something extraordinarily important at this point in time, because he does write his gospel to a Jewish group more than the other gospels. That doesn't mean he wrote it from Jerusalem and Palestine. I suspect it's probably Antioch. Would be my best guess, but I don't know that for sure. Neither does anyone else. But that idea of the peacemakers, there's a different way of life. I mean, granted, the zealots was overemphasizing, and it cost them the ruin of Jerusalem and everything about it. The Romans destroyed everything. But having that kind of attitude from a humanity standpoint is one of destruction. It isn't going to work. It has never worked. The most powerful armies in the world are successful for short periods of time, and they get destroyed again. So what's the answer? Jesus said there's peacemakers, that we learn to live with one another in a way that draws out the best out of somebody, that we live our lives so that we're entertaining a relationship with people, we're growing with people, we're treating people the way God wants us to treat people. That's what his message is here. Remember, the Beatitudes is that entree into Jesus' teaching. It's sort of like, okay, here's a capsule of what I'm going to talk about. And he puts so much emphasis on these aspects, if you will, and says, okay, find those as I go through and give you the word, the teaching that I'm going to entertain here. And he eventually gets into the 6th and 7th chapter and gives us a broader perspective on it. But so this synopsis, if you will, is one in which we can say, well, am I doing what God wants me to do? But we shouldn't do this in a way that says, okay, God, I'm going to do the details here and I want you to measure it and see how well I'm doing. We don't look at it and say, okay, if I do all these things, I'm going to go to heaven. We do that, but we shouldn't. And that's not what this is meant. It's meant to say, when you follow me, Jesus says, these are the kinds of things that you will be doing. And we ought to grow from that. We ought to expand on each one of these Beatitudes. We ought to make every effort to see a very viable aspect of that in our lives. Comments, questions? Yes.
I think this, of all the statements he makes, is probably the most profound for a Jewish audience, because for their entire existence, they have had to fight for everything. In many cases, God's commanded them, go into this country and wipe everybody out, and I'll deliver you. And then Jesus comes along and says, no, you got to be a peacemaker. And then I think it signifies the switch from an earthly kingdom, which was through the Jews, to a spiritual kingdom through Jesus. Because when Jesus is taken before Pilate, Pilate says, basically, are you the king of the Jews?
Are you the king of the
And
Jews?
he says, well, if I were, my followers would be here fighting for me now. My kingdom's not of this earth.
Yeah.
And I think that's a difficult passage for any Christian in any age to know where that line is. And I think the line, at least in my mind, is defending yourself versus defending others. I think is a difference, because God does expect us to take care of those that are weakest among us. But how many Christians in the first century willingly walked into persecution, knowing they were going to die, knowing everything was going to be taken, and they didn't even, like Jesus, they didn't even open their mouths.
Yeah. And becomes particularly important in terms of the Jews. That's why the Zealots did what they did, is that they had anticipated that God was going to be with them and they were going to be militarily successful. In other words, we were able to throw off the Romans with no problem whatsoever. Let's just get out there and get it done. I think I gave you the example last week after I gave the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Qumran group was basically academic people. They were like John, They were professors. They were writers. They copied things. And so when the Romans showed up, they thought they knew that they were the sons of light, that God now was giving them the opportunity to take on the Romans. And they went out there with their pitchforks. Well, Titus says, yeah, that's not going to be much of a problem, and he zapped them and wiped it off. Their thought process throughout this whole period of time was one in which God was going to give anybody, give the Jews success for anyone, no matter how powerful they were, even if it was the most powerful army that the world had seen for 200 years. So that was their attitude going into this. You're absolutely right. This is almost a flip-flop on what humanity thinks is going to work. The difficulty we have, and we can look at it and look back at it and say, every effort at that kind of action by humanity has failed. There's got to be a better answer. And Jesus says, I have one. I have one. I want you to be peacemakers. I want you to care about people. I want you to be willing to sacrifice for people. And that will enable you to see that you're a disciple of mine. Jesus has given us throughout this discipleship in every form of fashion. And you can look at this and say, it's about the kingdom. Are you being disciples for the kingdom? Are you being disciples about a mission? Are you living the kind of life that that people will look at and say they're different? There was a leader, ISIS, from in Italy, 1200, died 1225. But he had his followers. He said, "Go preach the gospel, and if it's really necessary, you can talk about it." That's an amazing statement. He's not saying go out there and use verbalization. He's saying go out there and show them that you're a disciple. And if you really have to, okay, talk about it. But more than anything else, exhibit the fact that you're a disciple. Pick that up, and that will move the kingdom. I think that's what Jesus is saying here as well. Comment, questions? Yeah, Doc.
Reformation and Counter-Reformation, they did pick up on this. I mean, they were all very military, specifically Calvin, Luther, say that's killing fences, they're revolting. Got Jesuits and others who were very violent, very active militarily. What did they do with this? Sermon on the Mount? Is that not in their Bibles at that time?
Oh, obviously it was in their Bibles at that time. They had the same kind of translations that we were capable of doing. I think they missed the point like we missed the point today. We look at it and say the peacemakers to us, at least, is that one in which I'm trying my very best to get along with somebody, but I don't have to understand them. I don't have to love them. I just have to get along. And the more violent way I can bring them into a relationship with Jesus, well, I'm helping them. You know, if they die because of that, well, I'm helping them. I mean, that's our argument these days. We did the same thing. We've done the same thing. Our Western society is set up on that way. We go about handling third world countries and saying we're a benefit to them. We're a benefit to them because we overpower them, etc. We're not a benefit to them by showing them how to be peacemakers. We're not a benefit showing them some of these other things. We're not showing them those kinds of things. We are giving them power. And that doesn't work. Hasn't worked. Never has worked. There's no historical background for success where military power works long term. It just doesn't. Comment? Any other? I don't know that I answered your question, Dr. Richard, but I don't know that I really have an answer for it. Let's go on before I get off on more tangents here. We get a change a little bit here with second, third person, because 9 and 10 verses really just reemphasizes an 8. Blessed are the peacemakers. I already did that one, for we be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness. He changes his point of reference here to the third person, in effect, saying those who do these things. He's talking about the disciples. He's getting down to the nitty-gritty here, and blessed are those who are going to be persecuted. He's talking about himself. Jesus is telling us that this will happen to him, and he anticipates that happening to all his disciples. Does that make sense to you? He's reaching out, trying to touch our lives in the 21st century as much as he's touching the first century disciples that are around him. This is not, by the way, the 12, necessarily the 12 apostles. Why do I say that? Does anybody know? Who wrote this gospel? I know you can answer that question. Huh? Matthew did. Matthew doesn't become a disciple until the 9th chapter in this text. So what is he talking to? He's not talking to the 12. He's talking to the disciples that are following him on an intimate basis. And he said, these are the kinds of things that I would anticipate that you're going to display because I'm going to be doing it myself. Does that make sense to you? In other words, he's talking to his disciples. Then that is not just the narrow 12 that we think of, but he's talking to the group of disciples that seems to be following him on a regular basis and adhering to what he wants. And he's talking to all of us. It's an application to all of us. We do not need to narrow it down and say, well, this is, and some have done this, by the way, that this is such, these Beatitudes are so narrow, and not narrowly focused, but so difficult to follow that he must have been talking to just the 12 apostles. No, he's talking to disciples who are following Jesus, disciples who have committed themselves to Jesus. Yes, no, anyone, everyone? Am I getting through? Oh, good. Okay. Well, let's go on to 11 and 12, which again is a reflection of the prior one. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Again, Jesus is repeating that which is going to happen to him. He's gone through and already told his disciples that that's apt to be happening to him. Well, not apt. It will be happening to him, that he is going to be facing this issue of persecution. And Matthew gets into it with the with Peter's acknowledgement that that he is the Christ. But just after that, he tells them that he's going to die on the cross. So again, people, and when they insult you, they persecute you, they falsely accuse you because of me. If you're doing that, if your persecution comes because of following Christ, and that's a criteria, not following what you think Christ said, but following what Jesus has truly said, which means that we have to go into the Word to find out what he said. We have to study it. We have to understand it. We have to put it in context. We have to believe it. Again, go out and teach the gospel, and if you have to say something, do it, but teach it with your personality, teach it with your methods, teach it with your life. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. We get a supreme example of that in Acts 7. I had to think about that for a moment. Who was that? Who gives us a fantastic presentation in Acts 7? Stephen. You are doing exactly what your forefathers had done. You persecuted the prophets. You put to death the prophets. And in a few minutes, it's going to happen to Stephen. And they stoned Stephen at the end of that chapter. This has been going on in humanity. Jews were supposed to be the teachers, and they failed in a very real sense of the word. They weren't able to do what God wants them to do. And Jesus comes and says, here's what you ought to be doing. Here's the kind of perspective that you ought to have. You ought to be peacemakers, not zealots. Yes? No? Yes? Well, it's a fantastic question, and I get asked that periodically. Fortunately, not as much. I had to address a young group a few years back when I was a full-time minister. Why did I become a Green Beret, no less? You know, not just a military person. Why did I do the kinds of things and train for the kinds of things? You have to answer those kind of questions. I don't know that I have a good answer for you. I know what my thought process was, that in effect I was defending those that I cared about. And I wanted to do it in the very most effective way I possibly could. And yes, I went into an elite group of training. But any of our military people are trained to do that. And the difference is here, they were attacking people. If you would look at the zealots and say, well, they were an elite group, they were very good at it, by the way. Assassinations were very good. Why is, just an example, why is Judas called Iscariot? Do you know? You probably know. He was it's a group of people that were assassins. That's what that meant. Those carrying those little knives is what they had a special little knife that they could hide, and they'd go up and execute people. More than likely, why Judas did what he did, by the way, after being with Jesus 3 years, he realized Jesus wasn't going to take over being king. Well, I don't need any part of that. That's not what I've signed up here for. I want to be a part of this group that's going to take over the world, you know. And that was Judas's excuse, I suspect, if we had a chance to ask him. It is the attitude of defense versus aggression. That's what I would give the best answer for. Not a good answer, but it's the best answer that I have. Since that question has come to me lots of times. And it's a great question. And it's a question each one of us have to answer. Males perhaps more, maybe not in future societies where women are joining the military, but certainly that's the case. Is it an aggressive act? Can you justify the Holocaust? No. Can you justify German in World War II? No. But I'm sure they have to answer for that. So, not easy answers. But we look at this here, and it says, am I portraying that kind? You see, this is not, got time for a sermon. This is not talking about those individuals who are very meek in the sense of withdrawn and whatever. This is meek in the sense of a relationship with other people. How am I treating other people? How am I looking at other people? Do I look at them as God's looking at them, as part of His creation? Or do I look at them and say, well, I'm either going to attack them and be aggressive, or I'm going to be withdrawn way and not do anything? We're not being told not to do anything. We're told to go out into the world and portray this.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that Jesus is saying these words, but we also have the example of Jesus' life. And while Jesus never took a weapon and went on the offensive,
Maybe a whip?
well, in that particular case, he was rightly justified.
Of course.
Purging the temple. But he had no qualms of taking on the establishment when they were wrong. He would stand and call them out. I think he even called the leaders, you brood of vipers.
Yeah.
Very confrontational language when they needed to be addressed.
Yeah. And this is not withdrawn. This is not a monastic kind of life. If it was, we could go off and say, well, let's let the world do whatever it wants to do and I can be separated. That's not what our job is. We're being given, and it says, go out there and show them how to live what God wants you to do, how He created humanity. And you can't do that for isolating yourself off from the rest of the world. It may be easier, but you can't accomplish the task. John. Gordy said something along those lines last week. He asked a question. The only comment I have to that is not to allow us this idea of which spirituality is isolated. And I know you don't mean that, but I want to add to that. Spirituality isn't what I do on Sunday and my vocation I do on Monday through Saturday. Spirituality is your vocation, and everything else is an advocation. I go to my job and I earn money is an advocation. It's not your vocation. Your vocation is your spiritual life that's 24/7. Your regular job is whatever hours some of you put in. I don't do that anymore. But whatever hours that you put in is an advocation. And we can't isolate our spirituality from the rest of our life. It is part of our life. When we go through our avocation, when we go through our jobs, when we go through doing nothing like what I do, or we go through about teaching or whatever, that is in relationship to my total spirituality. Don't try to surface it out and separate it out. We tend to do that a little bit. Well, this is spiritual and that isn't. No, it's not. It's all spiritual, and what I'm doing has to be done in relationship to the fact that if I'm poor in spirit, then I need to be getting more from God, or asking more from God, if you will, or receiving it. But does that make sense? Did I add something that you didn't mean, John?
I was just trying to emphasize that there's a disconnect between natural disconnect between us and God.
That we do. Not from God's point of view, but that we tend to do.
As Christians, it's our responsibility to help bridge that gap.
Pull ourselves back together. We become that humanity creation, that new creation Paul talks about, that pulls us in relationship to God. That's what that's all about. Other comments, questions?
I get these emails sometimes that says, this is not church related.
Well, they're being kind and they're trying to define.
What you just said, everything we do is church related.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure what, yeah.
I scratch my head and not thinking straight or what's going on there.
Well, they're trying to be kind and relate it to something else, and I'm sure they don't mean that. But in some ways, psychologically, we tend to try to separate those. And we can't do that. We can't do that. It isn't possible for us to separate our physical life versus our spiritual life. It is all part of being a spiritual person. Awfully important. Because if we get into that syndrome, then it says, well, what I do on Sundays is okay, is good, and what I do on Mondays is different, and that's okay too. And that's not the case. Go about teaching with our lives, and if it's necessary, we can preach. Let's go on. We're going to get into this 13th verse, and we get into discussion of salt and light. Salt was something that was crucial to existence. We don't think much of it because we get it so readily available to us these days. But then it was not simple. It wasn't easy to get. And it wasn't pure by a lot of means. But it had so much of an effect. Even somebody, a naturalist, Pliny the Elder. Anybody ever heard of him? Yeah. Ironically, he dies. He'd been a naturalist. Vesuvius erupted in 79 A.D. That's the volcano that buried Pompeii, and he died in that. He was a few blocks away, but he died with that. Being a naturalist, and the volcano blasted him seems to me sort of ironic. But he's indicated in one of his quotes that what was crucial for humanity's existence was salt and daylight. That those are the two crucial aspects that he saw as a natural part of living, was the salt and daylight. Jesus says something very similar here, although he takes it a great deal differently in terms of salt and light. The Qumran group with the Dead Sea Scrolls, they kept talking about the sons of light and the sons of darkness. And of course, they interpreted that themselves being the son of light. And Jesus tells us in John 8, I am the light. And he's trying to show that kind of atmosphere that says you can get rid of darkness in your life, darkness in your existence, by following Jesus. That's what he's about to say here in terms of salt and light. So as we dive into this, salt was used in all kinds of ways. We see in the Old Testament, it was used in sacrifices, it was used in tasting food, and they would sometimes, and salt really didn't lose its saltiness, but Jesus said that's possible. Oh, what's he talking about? Well, physically, they would get blocks, sometimes rocks and whatever that had salt in it, and put their stuff between it, and that would it tended to cure it for longer. Didn't die as quick. They didn't have refrigerators, by the way, in the first century. That's because they didn't have electricity. But anyway, and they would cure their stuff. Well, after a while, the salt would in effect come out of the rocks, and the rocks wouldn't be any good. You had to throw it away. Well, that's what Jesus is saying, that we need to continue to cure and continue to be salt, continue to be tasteful. Let's read this. You're the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, which, by the way, technically it can't happen. I'm not sure why. John can explain that. How can it be made into salt again? It can't. It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. They would go down and get the blocks, ironically, from the Dead Sea, which had all kinds of salt. I think I told the group the other day that it's 33% salt. The Dead Sea is one of the saltiest seas we have. Not the saltiest one. There's one in Antarctica that's worse, or the Arctic. I can't remember which. But in any case, they'd go down and get blocks of this, and it had all kinds of other stuff in it, and it would tend to disintegrate. Jesus said, "You are the salt. You're there to continue to cure. You're there to provide people with the ability to cure themselves, because you're there to bring them a relationship to God." And which is a little bit of what John was talking about earlier. We're there to pull people into a relationship with God. You can't do that in a monastic kind of attitude. You can only do that by going out into the world and accomplish that. You are the salt. Does that make sense? Yeah? Register? Anybody? That's what Jesus is talking about here. Yeah.
People that sort of ascetics that want to go off to a monastery or out in the woods and pray, and what is it? That's their mission to pray all day long, and join people, or
Because it's easier to live that life. You're satisfied. That's why we find it easier to accomplish the task by avoiding everybody. If I don't have to interact with you, then I don't have to worry about how my actions are with you. And I'm not influencing a change. Am I making a change in my own life? Maybe. I'm not sure. But it certainly isn't what God wants us to be doing. It's not what these disciples were supposed to be doing. I think I've said it dozens of times in this group and as well as past. You get a group here that's 100 people, max. And in 300 years, they overvamped the entire Roman Empire. That's a phenomenal effort. And it can't be done any other way. It wasn't done militarily. You weren't going to beat the Romans that way. You weren't successful. But can you beat them by telling them about God and getting people to say, yeah, their way isn't good enough, hasn't been good enough, doesn't work. The church grows under that kind of persecution effort. But Dr. Richard, I don't, people have felt for a long time that the easier way is to just isolate themselves, go off into the desert. For a period of time, maybe there's value in that. Get your mind right, but your objective ought to be what Paul's was. Paul went out in the desert too. Jesus went out into the desert. But they came back reinvigorated and said, now I'm going to show the world what it is to be a Christian. If you don't do that, then the time spent is ineffective. You're not God's instrument for success. Yeah.
I'm thinking about this analogy of salt. Jesus says we're the salt. In the ancient times, and even today, flesh is preserved or saved through salt. You rub it in salt, and that keeps it from decaying and wasting away. So we're the salt. We're the thing that saves the world from being eaten away, destroyed over
And we
time.
do it through the flesh. We do it through one another. Yeah. Excellent point. That's what we should be doing. And the only way we can go about doing it is to bury ourselves in as much as we can understand the text. What God wants us to do, what God has done. And you say, well, I don't know everything, Howard. I can't remember everything. That doesn't matter. What matters is how much of it you're grasping and how much you reflect into those around you. I guess I'm almost done. Rejoice and be glad, and because great is your reward in heaven, the same way they persecuted the prophets, etc. I've already read that. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, etc., there's no longer of any value. And then he jumps, and I won't get into the light, but that period of time, darkness came on. You can't. It's really hard to describe without peripheral lights that we get from the city and how dark things get. And a few years ago, I went hiking into the Death Valley area in the middle of July. Not one of my, maybe not very smart for some people, but I had a great time. You know, I mean, it's 120 degrees. I thought that was great. But I want to tell you, when it got dark, it was dark. You could not see your hand in front of it because we had no peripheral light. There was no residual kinds of things that come up there. That's the kind of thing that they had in the first century because they didn't have Thomas Edison. There was no light bulbs. There none of this. So being the light says a little bit of light will get rid of a lot of darkness, no matter how small it is. So they had these little containers that we've dug up, and they put things in it, and a wick went into one side, and they'd put it as high as they could get it because it would disseminate the light. That's what Jesus is talking about. So you're next week you can read about that, but you want to put the light as high as you can get it. More than likely, Jesus is talking about Jerusalem here, light on the city, being as high as you can get. You cannot hide the light. If you're the light, and that goes right back, if we're the salt, then we can't be hidden that way. We're going to show it. And if you're not showing it, then we don't have the light of Jesus in our lives. And we need to get that. Make sense? And I'm being cut off. So thank you very much. And next week, Byron will be